So this was a topic that I wanted to tackle for quite a while, a topic that often gets discussed amongst the community, with even a few other channels that have also gone into length regarding the state of arena FPS games. To clarify what arena FPS games are, they are commonly associated with small and chaotic maps with fast movement, lots of verticality, item pickups, resources, power-ups, and equal access to weapons. The obvious examples in this case would be Quake, Unreal Tournament, the two giant pillars of the arena FPS genre that most people will generally think of. Beyond the shadow of those games, you then have the plethora of Quake and Unreal clones that would prop up in the 2000s and the 2010s that would go for the most part unnoticed. Then you have the Halo games, which had incorporated most of the core components except the speed, and had placed a weapon limit, making it more accessible for console players, and would be the dominant multiplayer shooter on consoles in the 2000s, at least until COD 4 was released. As a lot of people have stated and witnessed, the genre has been more or less dormant for a long time, with only Quake Live and Quake Champions having the biggest numbers, at least if you go by the Steam charts anyways. There are a lot of theories and reasons as to why the genre has declined. After some lurking across the community, as well as a fruitful discussion with someone who has been involved in the Quake community for a long time, I'll share some thoughts on the matter. Number 1. Scale and time. You can take any of these games that fit the arena FPS category, and you'll notice that they all have generally small maps, but aren't too suffocating either. The small maps work in arena shooters because of the constant action that comes from it. People that have stuck with Quake and Unreal enjoy this aspect because the action never stops. It's like a dance between you and your opponents, trying desperately to finish each other quickly. But because of the chaotic and fast nature of these games, new players are going to become immediately overwhelmed and are not going to know what's going on. Just about every arena shooter after Quake has the exact same problem, where you dive into a map, people are darting past you like shooting stars, then you get blown up out of nowhere, you're left dazed and confused, so you start moving like a kid in a candy store, laced with bombs that blow up in your face if you touch them. You keep dying, you wish you just had a moment where you weren't immediately put into a fight. Someone then comes along, a person that has grinded this game way more than you, keeps killing you. You keep trying to kill him, but to no avail. This goes on for as long as you allow it. Eventually, you just throw up your hands and quit the game entirely. This is an experience that a lot of casual players have with games like Quake and Unreal Tournament. The maps are large enough for fast-paced movement and vertical jumping, but not large enough for a new player to take a moment and play at their own pace. Some people have stuck by it, have had to go through the arduous process of getting through the shittiest part of getting good at games like this. It can take from 50 to 100 hours and even more than that, just to reach the peak of Quake's gameplay or Unreal Tournament's gameplay. The map size isn't so much the problem, mind you, but it's the speed that is associated with it. Even with games like Apex Legends or Titanfall 2, they both have larger maps that allow for more downtime between fights. They simply give you more time to breathe, and you can play at your own pace in the beginning. In Quake, this is something that is flat out impossible to do, and a lot of casual players give up because of this. Those two aforementioned games are incredibly fast once you've realized the mechanics behind them, offering some of the smoothest movement you'll find today. They're fast paced, but they have larger scale maps that allow the player to take their time to build up the necessary skills to get better. With arena shooters like Quake, you have to get good by being shit for dozens of hours just to be able to experience the best parts of it eventually. That's the difference. You cannot take your time at all in arena FPS games. You are always placed at a fight, and even if you have a moment of peace, it only lasts seconds before you come across other players that are going at breakneck speed. Casual players aren't so much confused by the speed, mind you, but rather the chaos of the fights that are already breaking out. Take a look at Halo for instance. The map sizes aren't that far apart, but the speed is slower, making it in effect less chaotic. You can read the opponent's movements easier than you can in something like Quake and Unreal Tournament. Casual players can adjust to faster paced games, but not when they're constantly dying every second and can't figure out the reason why. And when they finally get into a fight, they're then hit with another aspect of arena FPS games that make them really hard to get into. Number 2, time to kill and weapons. Arena shooters have high time to kill, even in Halo. The association with player speed and resources means that even in the midst of chaotic fights, players always have opportunities to dart away and quickly find armor and health, or wait for the shield to recharge like in Halo. First time players are going to struggle with getting a kill because of this, not to mention the breakneck speed of other players. Some weapons do more damage, but it's also a matter of building up the skills to use them effectively. Speaking of which, All of the weapons in Arena FPS games have a unique property surrounding them. There are different things that you have to account for. Say with a lightning gun or a machine gun in Quake, you have to be good with tracking, because the damage output is low. With projectile-based weapons like the grenade launcher, rocket launcher, and the plasma gun, you have to be good with reading the opponent's movements, and have timing on top of it. The shotgun you need to be precise and up close with. With the railgun you also need to be precise, but also be able to hit targets at a longer range, which at the time are generally harder to hit. For some people, having equal access to all of the weapons is a blessing, but for a lot of people, it happens to have the opposite effect and becomes incredibly overwhelming. Each weapon is unique and takes a considerable amount of time to get good with. And with the high time to kill, you'll be struggling to get any kills if you're stuck with the starting weapon and aren't actively looking for other weapons. You're constantly trying to shoot other players and nothing seems to be happening. And because of the high time to kill, you can't solely rely on one weapon. You have to be on the lookout for weapons and resources all the time so that you have more opportunities to strike the final blow. Compare this to games like Counter-Strike and Call of Duty. The time to kill is really fast, and a first-time player can get more immediate results from this. A new player is going to do a lot better in those games the first time around than playing Quake or Unreal Tournament the first time. I guarantee it. Now, of course, you can take power-ups or quad damage into account, or even modes like Insta-Gib, but a new player isn't really going to know about those things. They're not going to know how all the weapons work, and they're not going to have the time to learn them at their own pace either. Like I've already said, you have to do everything the hard way in arena shooters. It's a do or die situation that immediately points a gun at your head before you can even contemplate anything. And most casual players do not want to deal with this shit. Most just want to sit down, get into a quick game, get some kills, and unwind. Arena games are hard, but that doesn't mean casual players don't like hard games. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Arena shooters are hard, but don't allow first-time players to play at a level of pace that they're comfortable with. This is why games like Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch work, and games like Quake and Unreal Tournament don't work anymore. Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch can be incredibly fast-paced, but the pacing is balanced out by the classes, the heroes, and the respective loadouts that they have. You can take your time with each character and get comfortable, and even play slower characters like the Heavy class, Winston, Roadhog, Sigma, or Orisa. They have abilities and loadouts that are unique to them, and you're not overwhelmed with the weapon options that you have in arena shooters. Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch are incredibly flexible in their speed and pacing, that first-time players will have a much easier time getting into those games than say in something like Quake or Unreal Tournament. Take Call of Duty for instance. They have weapons that are fundamentally the same. They all require precision but have different variables between them such as rate of fire, range, and damage output. Other than that, you just simply point and shoot in the right direction, that's it. In arena shooters, the weapons are all unique from each other and require different skills from the player. I hopped into a Call of Duty clone known as Combat Master, a Modern Warfare 2019 clone essentially. The game's movement is fast paced, but the time to kill is also fast where any weapon is viable. There is also movement tech that can be used to give yourself an edge and increase the pace of the game, but you can also just run around normally and still get kills. In Quake, you have more verticality to deal with, as well as the time to kill being much higher, making it harder to get results that will motivate the casual player to keep going. Number 3, difficulty. As I've said already, arena shooters are very hard to get into, and some in the community just boil down to casuals just not liking hard games. I see why they'd say something like this, but it's just simply not true. Dota 2 is one of the hardest games to get really good at, and yet it still has hundreds of thousands of players daily. And why is that? Because it can be played at any level. There are modes that warm the player up to play at a comfortable level. You can take your time with the learning process. The variety of heroes scale from being easy to use to being very technical. The matches are also pretty long and you're not always roped into a fight. You have to put a lot of time to get good at this game. But the problem with Quake and Unreal Tournament is that there is only one way to learn, and that is to be fast and quick and suck while doing it until you finally get good at it. Even casual games can be highly competitive. Take Fortnite for instance. The Fortnite that we knew in 2018 is completely different to how it is now in 2023. The skill ceiling in this game now is so unbelievably dynamic that it changes very frequently each year. Hell, each month. There are always new techniques being created, and it's all because of its casual foundations. With its large maps and downtime, that players are relaxed into the environment and can see a more gradual level of progress. You may not like the game, and you may even resent it for killing Unreal Tournament 4 like I do, but the game is doing a lot of things right in terms of movement, combat, gameplay flow, has a ton of custom games, and even a no-build mode for people that hate the no-building aspect. Audiences breed interest. Interest breeds commitment. Commitment creates competition. Competition cultivates a skill ceiling. These building blocks have turned Fortnite into one of the most competitive games today. But what good are those building blocks if there's no audience to begin with? And that is the problem with arena shooters today, where it's mainly just the long-time veterans and the rare breed of masochists that are the new players that have stuck by it, that still remain. Complex games can be enjoyed by casual players, but they have to be allowed to play at a level that they're comfortable with first. Number 3.5, the single player. Now, while the focus of this video has been on the multiplayer part of the arena shooter genre, we may as well bring up the elephant in the room, and that is the recent single player shooters like the recent Doom entries, Ultra Kill, Medieval, Dusk, Dimensional Slaughter, Reaver, Voidborn, and of course, Titanfall 2. They've had a great deal of success, and they've even been classified as arena shooters by some people. Here's the thing though, the single player arena shooters that people will refer to don't have the same issues as the multiplayer arena shooters. Difficulty and pacing are more flexible in comparison because of the difficulty modes that cater to different groups of players. In Doom, no one is forcing you to play Ultra Nightmare. You can just play on the easier difficulties and still have a good time. They don't have the same level of pressure as a sweaty lobby in Quake 3 or in Quake Champions. You can simply take your time with single player shooters, and some of them don't even have multiplayer, like Ultra Kill for instance. And to add on top of it, they don't operate on the same blueprint as a lot of other multiplayer arena shooters do. They may take inspiration from them, but that's about as far as it goes. The single player arena shooters I mentioned are unique from each other and actually try to do different things. There are a lot of derivatives, but for the most part, each single player game has something different to offer, and usually it's something beyond just gameplay and movement. Multiplayer arena shooters are trapped in this cycle of either making a Quake 3 or Unreal inspired arena shooter, or a clone for the most part, only for it to die off, or to try and make an entirely new experience, only for it to be ignored by the community for the most part, and its achievements are left unappreciated. Games like Doom Eternal and Ultra Kill do have a high skill ceiling with lots of weapon and movement tech that players can reach, but there's not as much of an incentive to go for it as say in multiplayer shooters like Quake or Unreal, unless you're either a speedrunner or it's a game that you enjoy so much that you're happy to keep playing it for the foreseeable future. Most casual players or first timers can get into these games, still have a good time, and then just simply move on. With multiplayer arena shooters though, they are much more unforgiving for casuals and first time players, and if they're not willing to put up with the brutal grind in order to get better, they're going to drop it really fast. You might think that the presence of these single player shooters may net in a larger audience for multiplayer arena shooters, but that's not really happening at all, because the numbers for the established multiplayer arena shooters that we know today haven't really changed or gone up in numbers, not by a huge margin at all. People's tastes have just simply changed over time, and the reason why single player arena based shooters work and multiplayer ones like Quake and Unreal Tournament don't is because the single player counterparts are more than just trying to be an arena shooter. They may have parallels or aspects of arena shooters, but they also have other aspects that people look for like lore, world building, characters, and even storytelling. And like I had already said, difficulty and pacing is more flexible and people can drop it and return back to it later whenever they want. If you do that with Quake's multiplayer though, you may as well just give up entirely. Number 4, change. This will be the most controversial point I make, and it may be something that a lot of people won't want to hear, but it needs to be said anyways. Arena shooters never really died. They just became something else. Think about the movement that you see in games like Apex Legends, Titanfall 2, or even the recent Call of Duty entries. They're fast-paced, but they also provide a flexible and scalable environment that grows an audience. The fast and chaotic arenas of Quake and Unreal Tournament aren't for everyone, but there's a difference between preference and accessibility. Arena shooters are generally, by nature, unforgiving and masochistically difficult to get into. They expect casual players to put up with being bad for a long time from beginning to end, and a lot of them don't have the patience for something like that. Games like Call of Duty, Overwatch, Team Fortress 2, and even Counter-Strike are easier to get into by comparison. They can be both casual, easy to get into, and still be highly competitive with a really high skill ceiling, with a faster time to kill that produces more successful results than in arena shooters where it's a constant dance between you and your opponent. In today's shooters, fights last seconds, but in arena shooters, fights can last minutes. Just look at some of the pro Quake players duel it out and see the constant struggle that they have with each other. In Counter-Strike or even Valorant, the fights are over before you even know it. Quake champions had tried to add a different spin on the formula with individual abilities for the characters, and a good portion of the Quake community ripped the game apart for it. They didn't want their perfect formula to change and evolve. They quite literally just wanted Quake 3 but with better graphics. The genre simply has not evolved past Quake and Unreal Tournament. Pretty much all of the old school arena shooters, as well as the new ones like Diabolical, Master Arena, Reflex Arena, Rats Instagib, and many others, all pretty much play the same when you boil down to it. The genre fulfills a niche and nothing more, while the shooter genre as a whole has been allowed to evolve and change, even to the point of giving us accessible games with fast movement. On the topic of Halo, it was mainly accessible because it was the main dominant shooter on the consoles during the 2000s, and people would get used to it. Not to mention its slower speed that made it easier for players to get comfortable with, of course. But they ditched it the moment that they could play something else, such as COD 4. Nowadays, we have a lot of movement-based games, where they still have a good degree of verticality and movement tech, but everything else applied to it makes it something more than just an arena shooter. Arena shooters need to evolve and move on from Quake 3 that had already perfected its formula. If you make another game like it, you're simply back to square one, and you're left again wondering why the genre is in decline. The thing is, the questions that have been asked regarding the arena FPS scene and why they believe it's dying, and what could be done to improve it, has already been answered. But it's not the answer that they wanted to hear. Regardless, the results speak for themselves. The games of today simply offer more accessibility and flexibility for level of pacing that gives casual players an easier time to grow the skills needed to become a pro at it. And that's really just it. I'm sure I've rustled a few jimmies with my last point, but it was something that I've noticed and I think it needed to be said anyways. I personally love arena shooters. For all their difficulties and imperfections, they do at the end of the day offer a unique and satisfying experience once you finally get past the barrier. There are still dedicated communities online and plenty of help that you can find, but you have to be willing to go through hours of torture, and I don't mean just by mere hours, I mean hundreds of hours, where it's their way, their pace, not yours. And that, if nothing else, is why the genre had declined and why it eventually became something else entirely as the years passed on. Thank you for watching.